Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Strom Jewish Community Center Arts and Ideas class, Mussar in the Time of Crisis, with the wonderful Alan Morinis, who is going to be Zooming in with us from Vancouver. We're very excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pamela Lavitt, the Director of Arts and Ideas at the Strom Jewish Community Center. And we're very excited to have switched a little bit up today by having you on a Sunday morning for a conversation about pandemic then and now, which I think is extremely relevant. Dr. Morinis was supposed to be with us in June live, and obviously Zoom has allowed us to bring him here, and generously he's offered his time and his support, and I think ultimately sees this conversation as really important at this time, how Mussar can be useful at a time of crisis. Instead of the conversation which we were originally going to have, and hopefully will still in the future, called All Love, No Lonely, or about love. And so with that, I'm going to be your host. I just wanted to tell those of you who are joining us that if you haven't taken a look at our virtual J programs, please go to SJCC.org or go to our Facebook page, Strom JCC or Seattle JFF, to learn about a whole host of programs. We're going to have some amazing announcements coming up this week, and I'm very excited that our CEO, Amy Lavin, will be hosting or co-hosting a telemedicine conversation on Thursday on the Facebook page for the Arts and Ideas Seattle Jewish Film Festival. So learn more and check it out and join us. Without further ado, I just wanted to quickly introduce our special guest today. Dr. Alan Morinis, for those of you who don't know, is the founder of the Mussar Institute. He's very good at Zooming, so hopefully that will overcome some of my own limitations today as your host. But he also is a Rhodes Scholar and a filmmaker and an anthropologist. And I think that that gives him such a window into how to see this particular moment. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this image to Dr. Morinis, and I'm going to step out, but I wanted to let you know how we're going to work the room today. You can enter your questions, but rather I think we might unmute people so you can ask your own questions. All you have to do is either enter something in the chat room and say ask, or if you want to go ahead and just say, I have a question, we will go ahead and get to your questions, and I will unmute you and let you know that you're on and you can ask your question live. So please welcome our special guest about everyday holiness, the author of Everyday Holiness, Dr. Alan Morinis. Welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining me on this rainy Sunday morning. I know it's rainy there. It's rainy here, too, in Vancouver. We usually share a lot of the same weather. These days, that's about the only thing we seem to be sharing. Coming down to Seattle was certainly not a possibility because the border is closed. So even though we're so close, we're so far. And in this kind of webinar or this kind of session, often we get to see each other, but this one got set up in this way that we can't. And so it's going to be a bit of a challenge for all of us to kind of enter into the exercise of imagination that we're actually in a room together, there's a bunch of people, there's a conversation, because I really want to encourage us to have a kind of joining of minds here and participate and learn something, and really, if all goes even better than I hope, then maybe even grow in some way. The title we chose, Mussar in a Time of Crisis, we thought we were being very, very up to the moment, because what we were focusing on and what we will focus on, I will come back to it, is the pandemic. And then, you know, even since then, there's been another crisis, which after Shabbat last night, I was watching the news, and the news is just astonishing. It's just horrifying and breathtaking what's going on in terms of the crisis of the moment against the backdrop of the pandemic, which is also the crisis of the moment. And here in British Columbia, there's a lot of talk as well about the opioid crisis that is also going on at the same time. So we're in a time of great crises. It's a plural now. Usually we get one, but there are so many things going on right now which are, in some senses, upending our world, upending our sense of normalcy and our routines and the way we've lived our lives. It's all just sort of seems like from day to day, it's becoming less and less settled. And we are being thrown more and more up into the air and also into uncharted territory. And as Pamela said, I founded the Mussar Institute. Now it's almost 20 years ago. And even before that, of course, I was studying Mussar on my own, and then with a teacher, and then with other people, and then eventually felt that there was enough of a need in the society, and especially the Jewish world, that it caused me to want to create a vehicle to be able to share the teachings of Mussar. And just really, really briefly, the Mussar tradition began in around the 900s in the Jewish world, and it has been developing over the last 1100 years. And the reality is, when we look at the crises of this moment, one of the great gifts that having a tradition can give you is that this is not the first moment of crisis that our people or our community or the Jewish world has faced. And of course, that goes back right to the Torah and all the way up from there, that there have been different sorts of crises in the Jewish world. And that history, much of which has been written down in the sense of books have been written. You see this shelf of books over my shoulder. Most of them are Mussar books that over the 1100 years that the Mussar tradition has been with us, we have been so fortunate that our wise ancestors took their lessons for living and they wrote them down and they passed them on to us. So that in a sense, we have resources that we can call on to look at the present situation and say, we have learned through past history. It may not be the past history of our own lives. It may not be even the past history of our parents or our grandparents, but broaden the scope, and the history of the Jewish world has come down to us to be guidance for living through our own particular life. And I think it's extremely important to call on that tradition, because if you look at it objectively, almost logically, we're going to get our guiding principles from somewhere. And, you know, there's a lot of media and a lot of vested interests that are trying to convince us this thought and this action and that action. And then there's, you know, wherever else we might get our ideas from. But there is something about drawing on a tradition that is hundreds and hundreds of years old, that has passed through generation after generation after generation of people, to guide this particular seemingly unique moment, which in fact is not unique. It's not unique in structure. It's unique in content, but it's not unique in structure. And in some places, even the content is not so unique, because even the fact of, say, political unsettledness or oppression or pandemic, epidemic, those are not new experiences. And we have been so very fortunate to live in such a settled and safe and healthy world that we are actually naive in that sense. We have not been exposed, we have not been inoculated to the unsettledness of the world, which is its actual more common condition. And so we feel a little bit at sea. And what I want to do is draw us back by taking advantage of the history that's being passed down to us to say, what guidance can we give? What guidance can we follow? What is the bedrock here that we can call on, which was there when the Tsar ruled, that was there in the Holocaust, that was there in the Crusades, that was just developing and developing and developing and continuing to serve Jewish communities in all sorts of times of crisis. The fundamental fact is that there are core Jewish values, which are the essence of the worldview and the manner of behavior that we are guided to follow. And these are strong inner qualities a human being is meant to inculcate in themselves, and then they become the basis for one's thoughts and actions. And that body of, call them Jewish values for now, I'll take it a little bit in a different direction in a moment, call them Jewish values. They are unchanging. They are not situational. When the Jewish tradition calls on us to be compassionate, or to exhibit chesed, loving kindness, or to adhere to truth, or to be humble, there's never a situational component to that. You take a quality like humility. Now, humility is, as with all these qualities, not necessarily something that understood through the common sense approach of saying, well, I know what humility is. I went to a conference on humility not long ago that was actually sponsored by a university. It was at the University of Oklahoma, and they were having a conference on humility. And I was the only person there representing a religious tradition that happened to be the Jewish tradition. And all the psychologists and the philosophers were giving their talks on humility. And every single one of them described humility as knowing your failings. And I became like a kind of parrot in the room because I kept repeating the same line. And I would add, and your strengths. And they would say, humility means you have to know your weaknesses. And I would say, and your strengths. Because the Jewish view is that a quality like humility is a matter of accurate self-knowledge. You have to know yourself. And then you have to be able to translate that into action in such a way as that I define humility as occupying your rightful space, not too small and not too large. The Jewish view, really as developed in the Mussar tradition, is that that's what humility is. Humility is occupying your rightful space, which means you're not a nothing. There's no aspiration to be a nothing. It's not accurate, it's not true to be a nothing. But neither are you so great and grand as to occupy all the space or occupy somebody else's space, impinge on that. So in the development of the Mussar tradition over these 1100 years, and going back beyond that into the Talmud and the Torah, but really becoming sort of congealed as a tradition, what you see is a focus on self-awareness as to which of the inner traits am I myself not manifesting my full potential. And this will be unique for each of us. One of the things I loved when I came upon the Mussar tradition was the fact that my experience of the Jewish world was very, very much about the collectivized approach. Everybody did everything together. Everything was about the community. Everything was about belonging. You know, in the prayer service, we all stood up at the same time. We all sat down at the same time. We all ate the same things. It was all very structured in terms of the collective. And I wondered, how is it possible that there wasn't in the Jewish world a tradition that focused on guiding the journey of the individual soul? And there is, and it's the Mussar tradition. And it was very much hidden from us. Most of us who grew up in the post-World War II world didn't see any form of spirituality in the Jewish world. And certainly the word Mussar was unfamiliar to most of the people, almost everybody that I spoke to as I began to investigate this tradition. People would say, I don't know what that's about. I never heard that word before. And yet there is, as you see, a bookshelf of books written over all these centuries documenting that. And that's another subject. Why was our Jewish world so despiritualized? But that's for another time. The way the Mussar teachers see it is that every situation we find ourselves in is offering us a personal lesson. You know it's a personal lesson because if you took somebody else and you put them into exactly the same position, they would respond to that stimulus, whatever's going on, in their way and not your way. Each of us is a unique soul, and the life circumstances we face are our own educational machine so that we can learn from our experience and learn which of these inner qualities in me is in some way not yet complete. The Mussar teachers talk about shlemut, which in Hebrew means wholeness, to be complete. And to have each of these inner traits, to be aware of them and see, where is there a possibility for me to grow here? What is the situation telling me about my own inner development, so that I will take that lesson, work on myself, cultivate that trait, and bring it into the world as I become more whole in responding to the world, and through that, making the world more whole. And you may notice the linguistic similarity between the word shalem, which means whole, and shalom, which means peace, because only when the world is whole, only when there is completeness will there be peace. And I think those are the kinds of lessons which, when you start to look at the contemporary world in which we're living, you can see that that is very applicable. So to just summarize this part, there have been in the Jewish world a number of values identified as being the core human values that we are meant to manifest in every situation, no matter what historical era we're in, no matter what crisis we're facing. And the list of them is long and, to a large extent, known to you. And I mentioned truth and compassion and kindliness and humility and so on. There's a whole body of these traits, but the essence of them, and what makes this a spiritual tradition, is that it is meant to be a curriculum that you take on. This is a learning process so that you recognize your personal spiritual curriculum in regard to those values. And the situations you face are teaching you something about how you yourself can change, can develop, can become more whole, can become a bigger gift to the world in which we're living, by recognizing your own relationship to truth, your own relationship to humility and arrogance, your own relationship to compassion and hard-heartedness, your own relationship to kindness and selfishness, and so on. This is really, from a Jewish spiritual perspective, what life is about. We're given the gift of a life, our individual life, our personal inner being is at every point not quite whole, and there are certain traits for each of us that are the focus points. Whereas one person may be very, very truthful, for another person, that's really the source of all the trouble in their life and the place of their focus where they are being shown by life experience, I need to grow in this area. The values have not changed. The values have been the same since the time of the Torah, because in fact, that's where they're drawn from. The perennial Jewish values are from Torah sources, and they give us the handbook for personal behavior, but even more deeply than behavior, the inner being we're supposed to be, the image of the ideal person I as an individual am supposed to be, have the potential to be, which is of course not the same as you. This is about the individual soul, the individual neshama, the path of the individual. And so if we look back at history a bit, what we see is that the kind of situation we're facing today, I'm not referring specifically to the George Floyd situation, but this talk could be entirely about that, and it would take the same form as you'll see that I'm going to take now in addressing the pandemic. Because the question is, what can we learn from history? If we don't learn from history, we'll be making it up as we go along and taking influence from other sources that may not be as profound and time-tested as the Jewish tradition. And so to give ourselves a foundation for thinking and feeling and acting and speaking from the most substantiated foundation we can, we have to look back in time to see, well, this may seem like a unique situation, unprecedented situation, but has it ever existed before in any way like this? In 1848, so 150 years ago, there was a cholera epidemic in Russia, and it was a devastating epidemic. It swept through all of Eastern Europe and including Western Europe. And in Russia alone, there were 1 million deaths recorded according to the count of the time from this cholera epidemic. At that time, 1848, people didn't even know what caused cholera. They didn't know that it was a waterborne disease. There was no real medical understanding. But there it was, the Jewish community, the entire community, but we're looking from the eyes of the Jewish community, what's a Jewish lens, the Jewish community was confronted by an epidemic. And in 1848, the incident that I want to focus on was brought into being by a man named Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. His actual family name was Lipkin, but he studied in the town of Salant in Lithuania, and he became known as Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. His significance in Jewish history, not necessarily as well known as it could be, and in my point of view, as you'll see, should be, is because he's known as the founder of the Mussar movement. Now, Mussar, as a Jewish spiritual discipline, dates back to the 900s. But around the middle of the 1800s, the 19th century, the Jewish world was undergoing a lot of change. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter realized that what it really was a confrontation between this traditional society, which had been very isolated from the mainstream of Jewish life in Eastern Europe in the mid-19th century and earlier. This had been an isolated community, and suddenly it was going to be broken wide open. The ghettos were going to be open. There was going to be emancipation. There was going to be allowing people to live in different places, adopt different professions. Jews would be welcomed to some extent, to a much greater extent, into the mainstream of society. And he recognized that this could be a very critical moment. This could be a very dangerous moment in a certain way, because Jews could become, as in fact happened to a large extent, completely assimilated and lose their own tradition and their own peoplehood. And his approach was really interesting, because what he chose to do, what he saw, what he had the insight or maybe the vision to do, was to recognize that the outer barriers that had protected the Jewish world, the ghetto walls, the anti-Semitism, the segregation, when all that was gone, the only way you could preserve the spiritual core of a Jew or the Jewish world was in the heart of the individual person, him or herself. The new place of security, the new bulwark against the influences of modernity, the negative influences of modernity, had to be situated within the core of the individual, him or herself. And that's what led Rabbi Salanter to take this pre-existing tradition of Mussar and to turn it into a popular movement in the 19th century, which grew and grew and grew, eventually took over almost all the yeshivas of Eastern Europe, very few exceptions. They all became part of this Mussar movement, right up until the Holocaust, when it was all smashed. The influence continued up until the present. Most of the Orthodox yeshivas in North America, and many of them in Israel, come out of the yeshivas that were strongly influenced by the Mussar movement. And that movement began right around this time, the middle of the 19th century. And at the same time, this cholera epidemic was raging through Russia and Eastern Europe. So along came the fall of 1848, the season, and what happened was Yom Kippur was approaching. And the epidemic was raging among the people, and Yom Kippur was coming. And the day of Yom Kippur, Rabbi Salanter was leading one of the prominent shuls in Vilna in Lithuania. And he went up on the bima, at the front of the shul in the Vilna synagogue. And he said to the people that because it was a time of an epidemic, they should leave the synagogue. They should go walk around in the open air, which was believed at the time to reduce the severity of the illness. As I said, they didn't know at that time that it was waterborne, so they were encouraging people to get fresh air. And he said that the fast of Yom Kippur was being canceled for that year. Now, this is the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Many people who don't go to synagogue any other time will go on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and many people who don't observe any of the sort of stringencies of Jewish observance will still fast on Yom Kippur. And he, in this Orthodox community, in a time of very traditional Judaism in 19th century Eastern Europe, he canceled the fast. And he told people that they needed to maintain their strength, and so they should eat. So that was his message from the bima, but he didn't stop there. He did two other things. He didn't just tell them that they should eat. He brought with him a plate of cake and a glass of wine, a cup of wine, and he made kiddush, and he made the blessing over the cake, and he ate on the bima on Yom Kippur in the shul, so that he not only told people what they should do, he showed them, he modeled for them, he led them through his personal example that this is what they should do in the face of the epidemic. That's one, well, actually it's two. One, that he canceled the fast, the other one that he demonstrated with his own behavior what he wanted the other people to do. And there was a third factor as well, is that he didn't stop at the ritual elements of the observance of behavior to counter the epidemic. He threw himself into the practical activities of the community. I've read different accounts on this. It's hard to know at this point exactly what's fact and what's myth. Everybody agrees that he took an active hand in treating the sick, in organizing the Jewish community in practical ways to take care of those who were ill, and because it was a disease that was causing a lot of fatality, he set up a program to deal with the orphans who were being left by the death of their parents. And there is really something to learn from him about our own dealing with the modern COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like to highlight three lessons that I would take from this prior era and put them in the context that I set at the beginning, which is, this is not just about how to deal with an epidemic. It's not just how to be safe, how to be a productive community member or whatever. This is about one's own spiritual growth. This is about looking at, how do I deal with this particular situation or any situation so that I am Hitlamdut means to teach yourself. And that notion is that you teach yourself from all your experiences in life, from every situation you face, from your response to everything that's going on. There are lessons for you, and this particular situation is there for you, so that in responding to it, and in this case, learning from Rabbi Salanter to respond to this situation, you are not only acting, in a sense, in the outer world according to Jewish values, you're doing it in such a way as to inculcate in yourself those values which this situation is calling on you to strengthen. So the exercise of dealing with the world is an exercise in spiritual growth. You can see here a very, very big difference in the perspective and the approach from a tikkun olam approach, which is all externally focused, to a tikkun midot approach, midot being inner traits, character traits, tikkun being to improve the character traits. In dealing with the outer world, then one has in focus self-cultivation, learning and self-cultivation at the same time. One principle, so I said I'm going to fairly quickly go through 3 principles that I think we can learn from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter that have huge importance for the contemporary pandemic. And then we'll go to question and answer, and we'll take this wherever you want to take it. I'm happy to go anywhere. Number 1, the paramount importance of preserving human life. This is hugely important. What was motivating Rabbi Salanter? Why did he cancel Yom Kippur? Why did he eat? Why did he make Kiddush? Why did he serve people who were sick, considering that probably put him in danger to some extent? And the answer is that according to the Jewish tradition, and this is really the rabbinic tradition and Jewish law, there is no higher value than preserving human life, pikuach nefesh, preserving human life. And so this is written down in Jewish law. If there is something going on that is endangering human life, that takes precedence over everything else. There was a board member of the Mussar Institute once who was a very observant Orthodox Jew who talked about one of the most exciting moments of his life was when he had to drive his wife to the hospital to deliver a baby, and it was Shabbat. And as he's driving his wife to the hospital, he thinks, I'm driving on Shabbat, I'm driving on Shabbat, which for him was like a once in a lifetime experience. But that's what Jewish law says you need to do. You need to prioritize the saving of life above all else that might be going on. And this is rooted in the Torah, where in Leviticus we read, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. The welfare of your neighbor is your responsibility. And the impact of that today is seen, you can see it on the news. You can see the people crowding the Florida beaches. You can see the people who are not keeping physical distance, people who are not wearing face masks. People are doing whatever they're doing. The question is, what is the value that is motivating them? Now, what Rabbi Salanter says is we should make our choices based on the principle of what can I do to preserve a human life? You know, it says in the Talmud that a person who preserves one life saves a whole world. And that, to give it that importance, is to say, in the face of this pandemic, what can I do that will preserve a life? And it's interesting because when you look at the protests that are going on about opening up the states and, you know, marching on the state capitol and haranguing and governors and so on, it's a valid debate. It's a really difficult debate to know how much to keep the economy closed, which has its own form of damage, or how quickly to open it up, which may have health implications of damage. That's not easy. This is a difficult decision. But the important thing is to look at what's motivating people. And I think what you see, and maybe this is also partly my perspective being a Canadian, is that there's a very, very strong competing value to the idea of preserving life in the United States, which is the value of freedom. And you see it. You see it on the placards. You see it in the slogans. You see it in people saying, no dictators, my freedom is the primary value. And this is really diametrically opposed to the Jewish values that we see in Rabbi Salanter's case, or that are actually underlined as being the primary concerns of a Jew acting in society. We have responsibility for other people, and our primary responsibility, more important than Yom Kippur, more important than Shabbat, more important than anything, is to save a life. If that means I have to wear a mask, because the mask, doesn't protect you so much as it protects other people from you, then the motivation is to save a life. And then to contrast that with the notion of freedom, that's not a very strong Jewish value. When you look at even the festival of our freedom, which is Passover, when you look at the story in the Torah about the slave seeking freedom, it's not freedom to be unfettered. It's not freedom just to do whatever they want. The demand on Pharaoh is, let us go free so that we may serve God. It's freedom to do something very specific, which is of a very high value for these people. And that's a different kind of freedom from the liberty that people are seeking today in this pandemic. So that's one lesson I just want to set up for you, that from the standpoint of Jewish values and the example of Rabbi Salanter, we get the image of preserving life should be the guiding principle for our own behavior because of our own responsibility to save a life, which could be our own life, or it could be the lives of others. That should guide us in terms of all the behaviors that are being asked of us at this time. And I don't see that as being generally held in the wider community. And you can pick up lots of examples where people's motivation is coming, in fact, from another value, a different value, not one that has been worked out in the Jewish community over these centuries. And I would have thought that 105,000 deaths would shock people into rethinking their values and what is the priority here. But it seems not so. So from a Jewish point of view, the more that a person asserts their personal freedom at a time of pandemic, the more they are creating the circumstances for disease transmission and therefore endangering other people's lives. That's not the approach of the Jewish world, as we learn from Rabbi Salanter. Rabbi Salanter does go further, though, than just placing this in a ritual context of saying, okay, so we, as here in Vancouver, we're not going to synagogue. Like, the synagogue is closed. The synagogue I go to is over 120 years old, and this is the first time in its history that it's being closed. And so that's one thing. But to go beyond that, there is a responsibility that Rabbi Salanter demonstrates for us of having to take responsibility in an active way for the community. In other words, to wear a face mask, to stay home, to observe physical distancing is one kind of behavior. But the other kind is to take a wider view of the society and see, what can I do that will be helpful to others? Not just protect lives, but actually take care of people in a broader sense. Now, in Rabbi Salanter's time, according to the stories, he got actively involved in the care of the ill. That was a different time, a different medical system, a different set of needs. But the question remains, and the question has to be applied to this context too. What can you do? What can I do to mitigate the damage at this time in the practical lives of other people, in their real situations? We know that this is not just a pandemic, it's an economic disaster. And so more people than ever, right at this moment, are dependent on food banks or food cupboards or whatever in the local community is the public distribution of free food to support vulnerable people. If you have the capacity, you have to ask yourself, taking Rabbi Salanter as a role model, What can I do to support people in their food needs? What can I do to support people in their social service agency requirements? What can I do to employ people? What can I do to, if people have property and they rent out, what can I do for my tenants? Everybody's situation will be different. Somebody may have no resources to give. They may be, in fact, on the receiving end of social services and food banks. Still, they have to think, what can I do for other people? Somebody who may have no money to give or no car to drive to deliver things could still make phone calls to isolated people. One of the real tragedies of this situation is how isolated people are, especially elderly people, especially people in long-term care facilities. And Rabbi Salanter's telling us from 150 years ago that we have to ask ourselves that question. Yes, we have to maintain our own isolation and all the other behaviors that are being required of us to protect other people's lives, but our responsibility as individuals to the community do not stop there. We have to ask ourselves the question, what can I do that will help other people in their time of need? Because this is also a Jewish principle. This is a very deep Jewish principle. You know, speaking of Yom Kippur, on Yom Kippur, we read in the Haftarah words of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. And it's interesting because they relate to fasting, just as the first instance was about Rabbi Salanter canceling the fast on Yom Kippur. Isaiah asked the people, I'll just read you the verses, is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not the kind of fasting I have chosen to loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. Not the fast of Yom Kippur, just no, I'm not eating today. My mouth is closed. That is the first lesson, is to do what is required in terms of the protection of life at a basic or medical level. But then Isaiah calls on us to ask the question, what can I offer or do to help people in need right now? Just as he did. He could have left it at his rabbinic duties. Like, okay, I did what I needed to do in the shul and it was extraordinary. But he took it much further. And that is something that we need to listen to as well. And I want to put it back into a spiritual context because, again, this is not just about Tikkun Olam. And I want to read to you something written by Rav Kook, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. And he wrote a thing called the Fourfold Song. And here's what he said. There is a person who sings the song of his soul. He finds everything, his complete spiritual satisfaction within his soul. There is a person who sings the song of the nation. He steps forward from his private soul, which he finds narrow and uncivilized. He yearns for the heights. He clings with the sensitivity of love to the entire Jewish nation and sings its song. There is a person whose soul is so broad that it expands beyond the border of Israel. It sings the song of humanity. And there is a person who rises even higher until he unites with all existence, with all creatures, and with all worlds. And there is a person who rises with all these songs together in one ensemble so that they all give forth their voices. They all sing their songs sweetly. Each supplies its fellow with fullness and life. the voice of happiness and joy, the voice of rejoicing and tunefulness, the voice of merriment, and the voice of holiness. There are people who live only for themselves. There are broader circles and broader circles and broader circles. And the point Rav Kook is making is that in dealing with the outer world, you have the choice, and it could be a spiritual challenge to see how expansive you can be. Wherever you may be right now, how can you expand from that boundary one more degree to be more inclusive of a wider circle as you have responsibility for them? I think it's a very poetic and very spiritual way of contextualizing, couching that lesson we learned from Rabbi Salanter of taking care of other people from a certain perspective. And this is a little bit of an advanced Jewish spiritual perspective, but it needs to be mentioned. It's in part because that other person is not other. There is a dimension in which they are us and we are them. There is a unity beyond oneself. To see yourself as being bounded only by your skin, that your reality stops at the boundary of your skin, is a failure to perceive a truth, which is the sense of our connectedness to others. And we are connected to others in a very profound and real way. And what Rav Kook is pointing out is that there are degrees, different people have a sense of wider and wider and wider connectedness. You know, again, to pick up the George Floyd theme, there will be people who say, well, it's a Black issue. There are people who say, it's not my issue. And there are people who say, it's a human issue, it's a humanity issue. But you can see you could create all kinds of concentric rings. And the question is, where do you sit in relation to isolation, where Rav Kook begins, or more inclusive perspective of responsibility and connectedness to the world at large? Okay, one more point and then I'll be done. So be giving thought to your questions if you don't have them already, and signal in the chat, and Pamela will pick up on that. There is a directive in the book of Deuteronomy which tells us to walk in God's footsteps. There is no question in my mind that what Rabbi Salanter was thinking of, how he was seeing his actions, was in line with this directive to model our personal behavior on what we learn of the ways that God behaves towards humanity, according to what we've been taught in the tradition. He wasn't motivated by civic duty, you know, a kind of secular civic duty. And he wasn't motivated just by the rabbinic duty, the halakha. That certainly guided him, but it wasn't just that he was doing a tick box of mitzvot, that did that, did that, did that. There was a much more profound motivation, because it takes more of a profound motivation to push a person to do the kinds of extreme things that we see that Rabbi Salanter did. And the guidance which comes through in the Mussar literature is to learn from the qualities we see in God, and then to model our own behavior on that, imitatio Deo, to imitate, to try and inculcate in ourselves these divine qualities. I say imitate, it's much more than that. It's to internalize. It is to become a person who is the embodiment of the qualities that we see in God. And there are sources which say things like, as God is gracious, so shall you be gracious. As God is kind, so shall you be kind. As God is compassionate, so should you be compassionate. In fact, one of the names of God, which if you were counting the Omer, which we just finished with Shavuot, every night this name of God got mentioned, which is Harachaman, the compassionate one. This is one of the traditional names of God. God is called the compassionate one. And the sources say, as God is compassionate, so should we be compassionate. And I think, and that's really where I will draw this to a close with a bit of teaching on compassion and kindness, because when we look at the qualities of God and we look at what the tradition has isolated and highlighted, spotlighted for us, it's that the qualities of rachamim and chesed, compassion and kindness, are very much highlighted as core Jewish values we learn from God, and we are meant to bring them out in our own life. Now, one of the things I want to leave you with as a teaser, in a sense, more to encourage you to keep learning, is the fact that on first blush, we may think we understand these words that we're saying in English, compassion, kindness, but without some study, we don't know what our own ancestors, how they defined and interpreted those terms. The word for compassion in Hebrew is rachamim. The word rachamim comes from a root, which is rechem. And the word rechem means womb, W-O-M-B. We have to ponder, and there are teachings and lots to still learn, what's the connection between compassion and the womb? Now, you may have answers. You may want to look into it more, because there are other answers that have come down to, not necessarily other answers, you may have hit it right the first time, but there are teachings that we can learn to expand our own understanding of our own inner life and of the ideals to which we are meant to aspire by looking into what the tradition has to offer about a quality like rachamim, a divine quality. On the high holidays, we sing repeatedly the 13 qualities of compassion of God. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, etc. Those are the 13 qualities of compassion of God. In a sense, we're being invited to investigate this quality of compassion and say, how do I bring that into my own life? And the same is true of chesed, kindness. I would say that before I did some study in the Jewish tradition, I did not know what kindness was. It's funny, it's such a common, everyday word, but it turns out that it has a Jewish meaning. In other words, there's a way to see kindness through a Jewish lens that gives it a particular quality and a particular meaning, and it becomes a particular ideal that we're meant to embody in our own life. And there's, again, as I say, a lot to learn about that. And so, just as a closing comment, when we talk about unkindness, that's always associated with the city of Sodom. You know, Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed. There's a term in Jewish law called Midat Sodom, which is the qualities of Sodom. And it was the opposite of kindness, and they're described in some detail. And Sodom was destroyed. And when we look at what sustains a society or a civilization, we can see with our own eyes today, by looking at the news or even looking out the window or going out into the street, what happens to a world that is not built on kindness. Olam chesed yibaneh. The world is built on kindness. That's what the Torah tells us. When you see a world which is built on unkindness, you have to think of Sodom, which God destroyed. And then you have to look at the fires in the street and the destruction being wrought on the environment. And you have to say, what should I do? And the answer from the Mussar tradition is to stick to the core values of the Jewish world. There is no other better refuge, there is no other better foundation than to make a priority of preserving human life, acting with responsibility to yourself and the community, and looking to internalize the ideal value so you become a representative, a representation of that which sustains the world in your own world. It may be a narrow world, it may be a great world, but to act with kindness and compassion and truth and humility, just as Jews did in the 19th century and the 18th century and the 17th century. And that's their legacy to us. And it's almost as if I can hear their voices calling to us and saying, don't forget, don't forget. Don't forget that chesed, kindness, and rachamim, compassion, and emet, truth, and anavah, humility, these are the primary values. This is what we are meant to bring into our own lives and through us into the world. That's what I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to put it in the context of Mussar and Jewish spirituality. And I wanted to put it in the context of previous centuries to give us a sense that we are not alone. We are not without resources. We are not without guidance. We may have to do some learning to know what it is, but there are sources. We have that to go to guide ourselves as we confront what seems to us to be an unprecedented situation, but for which there are, in fact, precedents. Okay, so let's go to questions. So the way this is going to work is that Pamela's going to unmute people according to what they've written into the chat in regard to questions, and then you can ask your question verbally once your microphone is turned on. So over to you, Pamela.
Well, I'll go ahead and just start it off. I had a question about how Mussar can guide us with the concept of a rightful space when space right now is something we are being told to distance from.
Mm-hmm. Well, that in a way is your answer. I mean, because what is your rightful space? There's no quantitative, it's a relative thing. In other words, what's relative to the situation? For example, a doctor in the doctor's office occupies more space than that same doctor in their home because it's a different context, same individual, but it's contextual. So from my point of view right now, going back to the precedent of Rabbi Yosef Salanter, the rightful space for an individual is being guided largely by the public health information that we're getting. And our job as individuals is to judge our space based on what will preserve human life and what, including our own, and to occupy that space. Now, you can, space is interesting because you see people walking in the street, at least I do here in Vancouver in the supermarket, with face masks. That's a space-defining tool. And so is a mask, a surgical mask, or an N95. All these this creates a control over your space. So I think, just like Rabbi Salanter, it's interesting because his medical information was wrong, in a sense. They didn't know till 1850 what caused cholera and how it was conveyed. Still, he was taking guidance from the doctors. He was still taking his information about going out and walking and breathing and eating. That was coming from the medical people of his time. So I think defining our own space depends on listening to authoritative voices and taking their guidance because they have the information. And that's very much in keeping with Jewish tradition. Even in an ordinary time, a person who is weak or ill or elderly or pregnant, that kind of vulnerable person, they're told by their rabbi to take the advice of a doctor to decide whether to fast or not. And they should certainly abandon the fast if they have medical advice. So that's where our space of humility has to do with listening to the expertise that's guiding us in that way.
I'm excited to welcome Rebecca, who says that she's read quite a few of your books and that they have guided her life. But I was hoping, Rebecca, you might, if not embarrassed to do so, chime in, the teacher's calling on you, to say a little bit more about what you mean.
I just learned from one of my teachers, Rebitson Rivi Klitenik, about Mussar and about you, and she recommended your books. And they really brought so much to me because I was not feeling very spiritually fulfilled, and I'm not active in any Jewish community where I live, and I needed something. I needed to feed my inner soul. And I felt that working with what you have been teaching has made me feel better. And by doing that, it has made
I've stopped hearing Rebecca.
Hold on, Rebecca. Let me make sure that you are unmuted. Yeah, Rebecca, somehow she stepped out of the chat. I'm not sure how. I hope she'll come back and then we'll go ahead and bring her back on.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe you want to just respond,
Well,
Dr. Morinis.
I have a phrase that I use to describe our generation, which I say is that for the most part, we are spiritual orphans. That we are the heirs to a very rich spiritual tradition in Judaism that we did not know about for the most part. And every so often someone says, yeah, I knew, I was taught. That person is the exception. Most of us across the entire spectrum of the Jewish world, from the Orthodox to the completely secular assimilated, we're not introduced to our own spiritual tradition in the post-Second World War era, as a result of which we are orphans. We don't know our spiritual parents. We may have had a very good family in the biological or social sense, but spiritually we were not introduced to our ancestors. And that, you see the result of that. You see how many Jews have wandered off into other spiritual traditions. The entire North American Buddhist world is led by Jews, and the yoga world is led by Jews. And because we weren't introduced to our own spiritual tradition. So Rebecca's question is, in a sense, a question that a lot of us have asked, and a lot of us continue to ask for ourselves. And we have work to do, because reopening our own treasure house of spirituality is not complete. It's not complete. We have work to do to create a tikkun, to repair, to make this a more whole Jewish world by addressing the inner life of the individual. That's been the key missing piece. That's why we're spiritual orphans. We may be physically well, we may have nice synagogues, we may have good kosher food, we may have books and publication societies and so on, but you, guidance for your own footsteps, guidance for your own arrogance, your anger, your indifference, your laziness, your whatever you got going on, the personal path of spiritual growth, there's still work to do to open that up. And that's certainly what I'm involved with, but I'm welcoming you all into my camp.
So I'm excited that the JCC CEO, Amy Lavin, has a question, but before I unmute her, I can tell you that she definitely has reopening on her mind. So that is definitely a thematic that she's been thinking about. So Amy, I'm gonna unmute you right now. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this morning. I was very excited to have you present to our community, as I and a couple of my colleagues who are part of our lay leadership here at the J have only started to begin practicing and understanding the book that you've written and the practice of Mussar. And so we're excited to bring that into the broader community. As somebody who's just started learning about this and started to understand some of the active daily practices one can take to become more cognizant and aware of these values on a daily basis, could you just share some of those activities or practices that you recommend so people are more mindful on a daily basis about this type of work? Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I just wish circumstances will, I hope, open up soon that I can drive down from Vancouver and get to be at the JCC and also make one of my ritual pilgrimages to Trader Joe's, which has not made it into Canada. So I feel very bereft in this situation. In general, the Mussar teachers taught many practices, but they made 3 core practices the backbone of being a Mussar practitioner. The focus is on knowing what trait you're working on. You have to know in the first instance, I am impatient. You know, I take responsibility. I recognize in myself that impatience is on my spiritual curriculum. Or it could be truth, or it could be kindness, or it could be compassion, or it could be humility, or it could be anything. Where our own inner traits, the world is revealing to us, that's on my spiritual curriculum. And once you know that trait, let's just take impatience for example. Once you know that, the 3 practices that a Mussar student does on a regular basis, daily, the focus may change, but the 3 practices remain consistent. Is in 1, in the morning, reciting a phrase, kind of like a meditation or a mantra. Rabbi Salanter was famous for his chanting of these phrases. Some of his people would be traveling with him. They'd hear him chanting all night, one phrase over and over and over. And that phrase would remind you in the morning. You use the word mindful or aware. You have to trigger that in the morning to say, ah, yes, I'm working on patience, or I'm working on whatever it may be. So there's a morning phrase. During the day, you actually have exercises to do. You can assign to yourself, or you're part of a Mussar group or a Mussar course, then you will have certain practices to do during the day related to cultivating that trait. Because it's not just a mental exercise. The experience of acting is one of the primary methods of transformation. So that, it's not a matter of saying, I'm going to practice generosity by thinking about being more generous. No, you actually have to do acts of generosity. And often these practices, which are called in the Mussar world kabbalot, they are quantitative. In other words, do 3 generous acts a day. And they may be 1 with your money, 1 with your time, 1 with your possessions. And so you get up in the morning and you remind, I said I would use patience as an example, but actually generosity seems to be coming more readily to my mind. You may in the morning say to yourself something about generosity, and then just to remind yourself, and then during the day you might do several generous acts, and then in the evening you keep a journal. And the journal is also a great tool for awareness, for mindfulness, because not just what you write in the journal, but because during the day, I am going to write in a journal. And knowing that you're going to write in a journal sharpens your awareness as you go through your day, because you're aware of what's coming. And so those are the 3 core practices, all of them simple, none of them technical. A phrase, exercises, and journaling. There are many other Mussar practices, but that's the core of a Mussar practice. And the idea is that over time, you internalize that different quality. When I was talking about kindness, I gave a webinar earlier, not today, another day, about kindness. The exercise in kindness is to smile at other people. The amazing thing is that when you undertake the practice of smiling at other people, you will find with certainty that they smile back at you. And then you can understand, wow, I'm living in a different world. I was living in a gray, unfriendly world. By changing my behavior, this world suddenly got sunnier and warmer and kinder. And then you realize, maybe Olam Chesed Yibaneh, that the world is built on kindness, starts with me. That I build a world of my own on kindness by my kind behavior. And then that's transformative.
Dr. Ellen Morinis, thank you so much. And I decided I would put my smiling face up here because I need to smile and say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your wisdom with us. And we do hope that you'll make it to Trader Joe's, as Linda Clifton said in the chat box. And that you'll come to Seattle with a further teaching when we can all create that space of humility together. So thank you. Any final words?
Two. One is that my talk, when I come, will still be on love, because it won't go out of fashion. And there's a lot to teach on from the Jewish tradition about what love is. I look forward to that. And in the chat box, I just typed my email address. And so anybody whose question did not get answered because there wasn't enough time, please email me and I'll be happy to carry on the conversation from here.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for your time. We hope everybody will use Mussar as a place to create space as we reopen our communities and our hearts to each other. Stay safe, stay well, and thank you so much, Dr. Ella Morinis, for joining us today.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Take care, everyone. Be well.